Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Parenting is Easy, Said No One Ever. I'm your host, Chananya Abraham, and I thank you so much for joining us. This has been an absolute journey. We are at over 50 episodes of the podcast, and this thing is really cool. And I have such an awesome interview for you today. But I just want to take a moment just to really thank everyone for all the support, questions, comments, and critiques that you guys have sent in and would comment to wherever it is that you listen to your podcast, and recommend anyone that's listening to this podcast to please like and subscribe wherever you listen. If you have any questions or concerns or would like to reach out and talk to us about yourself and a guest or critiques, please email us at parentingiseasypodcast@gmail.com, or you can contact us on our social media pages, which you can find in the show notes. Today, I have an amazing episode, which I got to be honest, we deviated so far from where I wanted to go, but it was so worth it because my conversation today with Rob Rohde was such a pleasure to have, and so moving to hearing his story as a single dad and not having support from a spouse, both from death and divorce, which is such an interesting and I think unique story, but at the same time, very relatable regarding anyone that is a single parent, and let alone a single parent. If you have one or two kids, he has 5 single kids. And there are so many different topics to talk about of creating structure, being fallible, and being curious that I think you're really going to enjoy this episode, because I think there's so many things that you'll be able to learn. And this is not just for single parents. I think this episode is for anyone that is a parent and just struggling with the everyday way of going about things. So sit back and enjoy this awesome episode. So, Rob, I'm so happy we're finally able to make this happen. This has been a long time coming, and there's so many different reasons why you and I needed to talk. And I think how people hearing from you regarding your story and how it can be so beneficial to what we talk about here on this podcast. And I think it's important for readers to know a little bit about you and background and where you're holding. And I think the most important thing, which we're going to focus a lot on today, is the fact that you are a single dad of 5 daughters. And there are so many areas and so many things that I want to talk about when it comes to that specifically. And the first thing that comes to mind for me, and maybe if you feel maybe you want to go into the story about being a single dad and how that came about, but is the concept of raising 5 daughters on your own and having that balancing act of being able to juggle, let's call it 5 flaming swords when it comes to making sure that you're doing things properly. So how do you go about making sure that there is a healthy balancing juggling act without you getting burnt?
Wow. Yeah. Well, first off, I just want to thank you so much for having me. I've been really looking forward to connecting with you and getting to speak to your audience. And so this is exciting. And I can tell already I'm going to love this interview because my favorite topic is my daughters. I could talk about that all day. So, as you mentioned, I am a single father of 5 daughters. Their ages now are 15 to 29. My oldest 2 are twins. But I've been a single father for about 14 years. My youngest was a baby when all of that happened. And so I have a lot of experience with it, and that's been my life for a long time, and I've kind of settled into it. And it is a challenge. And so there's been a journey. You asked the question about how do I balance my life and I think you were alluding kind of to all of the emotions and different age ranges and stuff of having daughters. And the answer is long, but I will start with the short version. The short version is I am constantly going through the process of trying to learn and trying to grow and trying to improve, because I make a mistake or 5 every single day, and so it's just a matter of what I do with that. And also, I would say that there are a couple of things that I absolutely center my parenting around. And those 2 things are connection and really what I've referred to as studying my kids. I put a strong emphasis on trying to connect with my kids every day, whether they are wanting it or not, regardless of the response that I get. And
Are they all living at home?
No, three of them still are. My 15-year-old,
Okay.
18-year-old, and 21-year-old are still living at home. Although the 18-year-old is getting ready to go to college here in less than a month and going away to college. And so, yeah, then there'll be two. But my 29-year-olds are on their own at this point. Yeah. But the two main things I focus on really is starting from a place of connection, and we can talk about that more later as we go through this conversation. And then the other piece, really, that I didn't do from the beginning, but I started doing it probably a couple of years in, and it made all the difference. And that was taking time to study my kids. I mean, literally study them, watch how they respond to a situation, watch how they are interacting with friends, learning their verbal and nonverbal cues, being able to identify when they are in a place of when they are excited about something, or they are sad about something, or they are embarrassed, or feeling kind of overwhelmed or stressed. And I think committing to learning my kids on a deep level has also fed into that piece of connection, and it all has kind of fit together. And I believe that everything we try to do as parents becomes easier when we're coming from a place of connection. And so that is a big piece of how I go about my life. And in terms of balance, I you and I have talked about this a little bit off air, but I think of balance a little bit differently. I know that we all want balance, or we all say that we want balance, but I think, for me anyway, what I believe that most people want is they want to be able to know at the end of the day that they spent their time doing the things that matter to them. They want to feel good about how they spent their time, good about how they lived their life on that given day, or that given week, or that given month, or given year. And that's really what we're all after. And so we think of balance as being the path to that, and it can be, but there have been many times throughout my life where I have fully and completely committed to living an imbalanced life, an unbalanced life, where I recognize that that was the situation and that's what was needed. And so I achieve balance by not worrying about balance, by really trying to be in that moment and focusing on prioritization and looking at what needs to happen, what is most important right now for my kids, for myself during this season of life.
That's such a great answer, and I think I understand the concepts of the focus, but also not paying too much attention to the structure aspect, so that you can be here and now and present. At the same time, you're like using the questioning from before. You're dealing with five flaming swords, and as much as when we're juggling, they're usually weigh the same. Each of the balls that we're juggling. I think when it comes to five personalities, even though there may be twins involved, personalities are very different. And when it comes to just being able to be focused, there can be a lot of distractions that come about in how you're trying to stay focused. So, what are some things that you've done and you've seen that you've been able to keep that focus, but knowing that there are different types of balls or different weights that are hitting you and trying to get your attention at the same time?
Yeah, so I am absolutely a man who loves his systems and his habits and his routines. And I don't know how I could have done life effectively without really having some consistent routines and systems in place. And I'm one of my older daughters has told me, Dad, you have a system for your system. I mean, there's just so many layers to it, but I mean, I do, and I try to be somewhat flexible with it. And it could be as simple as, how we divide up household duties. And it could be as complex as, how do I connect with my kids on a regular basis? But I have created habits to support the life that I want to have. And so I do follow a relatively strict, I'll say, morning routine where I do some very specific things each morning in order to kind of start my day off right. And then I also, one of the better things that I incorporated a couple of years back is having what I call a basically like a workday shutdown routine, where essentially I have a way of kind of putting work behind me and transitioning into that family mode. And prior to me doing that, it was a rough transition from work to home. Um, but that has been extremely effective. And what that includes is can be very simple or very complex, again, depending on the individual. But for me, what that involves is doing some actual kind of tangible tasks that I need to do, such as double checking my email, kind of closing up my laptop, writing down what I, kind of reviewing my notes for the day and putting those in the proper place so they're not just echoing in my mind. And then actually taking just 5 to 10 minutes to kind of just without the computer open and with just a pen and paper and myself and just think through anything that might just be kind of hovering in my mind or kind of bouncing through there. Because I would come home and I would be, prior to me doing this, I would come home and I'd be having dinner and I'd be in the middle of a conversation with my kids and I'd have these thoughts racing through my head about something that I forgot to do or something I have going on the next day that I had forgot to like prepare for. And so creating this, what I call workday, I actually stole this phrase, but what I am calling workday shutdown routine has really made a huge difference. And that's been hugely effective.
And how long have you been doing this for? And how old were your kids as you were transitioning into this shutdown?
Yeah. So I started doing it about 4 or 5 years ago, but it's just been the last couple of years that I can say that I've done it consistently. I experimented with it about 4 or 5 years ago. And so, my kids were still kind of older at that point. They were, I guess you would say they would be about 10 to 23, so they weren't super young. But there's a variety of things I've done throughout my entire kind of parenting life. Little things like having a kind of chalkboard hanging in the kitchen where we would write down like whose responsibilities were, if we had any appointments for the day, whatever we might have going on. And then another thing that I have done for the last couple of years, I've made it a formal process over the past couple of years. Prior to that, it was an informal process. And I've done this almost from the beginning. And that was sitting down at one point during the week and having what I now call a family meeting. And before, we would just have like family time. And during that family time, we would do like a little check-in where I would, when the kids were younger, I would let them know this is what we have going on during the week. And as they started to age, I would ask them, what do you have going on this week? So we could kind of talk through that. And then I would also share my schedule and things like that with them.
So it's keeping like that open. It's not just about transparency, but that communication that allows you to, guys could say, keep everything balanced in that sense. And I think that could be a way to go about things as our kids are older and developmentally they're in place and mature enough to be able to hear those things. When you're dealing with a 1, 2, 3-year-old, and you tell them to be quiet for a minute because you got to finish up a phone call, a little bit harder. And yes, you may have older kids also, and it's something that you had teenagers at the time, but you became a single dad. And maybe in a minute or two, we'll get into if you're comfortable talking about the story of becoming a single dad. But I'm curious first if you could talk a minute about you being able to have that balancing act, or what that was like, and the struggles that came with it, and I guess you could say the learning experiences that came with trying to juggle when you have little kids, when you have toddlers and infants at home, and they're all nagging and pulling at you emotionally and physically when it comes to wanting your attention. How were you able to go about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple layers to that. One is the piece of the, well, I'll just start here. So I started off trying to treat all of my kids the same and trying to have use the same methods for all of them, which was highly ineffective. And, I mean, there's really kind of these different kind of groups of kids that I have. I hate to phrase it that way, but my oldest two daughters, there's a pretty big gap between them and my other three. And the reason why is because their mom had them before I met her, but their father was never in the picture. And so I legally adopted them after we became married. And so there was a pretty big gap in between them being born and then my other three. And so they were already 4 when we got married. And so I didn't experience the infant stage until my third child was born. And one advantage that I had at that point, by the time she was 3, 4, was we had older daughters in the house. It could kind of help a little bit.
Right.
And so that was a help. But there's a few things that I had to do. Well, I guess I should close the loop on my discussion on trying to treat all the kids the same and how that was ineffective. I learned pretty quickly with my fourth daughter that so when Ember was born, who is now 21, she was easy. Everything I tried just worked. I felt like a super parent because it's like, wow, everything I'm trying is just working. She's following all my directions and we have a close relationship and it's just kind of easy. And I think what it was, now that I'm reflecting back, is that her personality and my personality are so similar that it just felt natural and easy in that way. And then when Samara was born, who is energetic and exciting and likes to be in front of people and kind of the center of attention and just uh, very social, she had a very different way of going about things. She really needed to understand why we were doing, why I was asking her to do things, and what was in it for her, sort of a thing. And so it felt like I was being challenged originally, and the way I handled that. Now we're getting to the mistakes. The way that I handled that was by using like discipline and things like that, instead of trying to learn and understand her and understand where she was coming from, and to use your phrase, just be curious, and being curious about where that was coming from. And so initially I didn't do that well. But over time, I recognized that if I wanted to have the relationship with Samara that I wanted to have, then with all of my kids that I wanted, I needed to change the way I was parenting. I shouldn't be expecting her to change, or it's not reasonable for me to expect her to change her personality in order to mesh with my parenting style. I needed to change the way that I was approaching the situation with her.
Wow, that's such a profound point, and thank you for bringing that up, because I talk a lot about in my office as a therapist the concept of not every kid fits into a educational or school system, and we have to figure out how a kid can learn in a way that works for them. But I think you're taking it in a step further, that at home it works the same way. Just because I might have my way of doing things, whether it's structure and discipline, that may work for me because that's what I think I'm supposed to be doing as a parent. That's not the way it works, because what we're supposed to be doing is making sure that we're parenting for the child and not parenting in a way that we want to parent. And it's such a good point. And I think, like you said, and to your credit, that a lot of that has to do with those mistakes that we make as parents, and we sort of see things. And it's by being able to stay subjective and curious that allows us to see them. This is not working. What can I do to change the situation so that things can work better for us? Now, I really want to get into the concept of how you becoming a single parent, but I have one more thing I want to talk about over here. I think the point that I for sure have difficulty, and I don't need my wife to point it out to me, because I know this is something that I need to work on myself. The area of being able to, when we talk about that balancing act of being a parent, realizing that I have to parent each child differently, and making sure that each child doesn't feel jealous of the way I'm treating the other child. And I think that's a very important point, because one child might say, "Hey, you're on top of me regarding my homework when I have to get to bed. But how come with Sally, you're not so strict, or you give her prizes when she does things a certain way?" And that's a very good question, because she's right. I'm treating her differently. But different doesn't mean different. Different means I'm parenting for what they need, and you don't need things a certain way. And I think, I would say one of the hardest points in parenting is when we are in a situation where we are parenting for each one individually, is to make sure that there is no animosity or jealousy from the other ones. And I'm curious, as someone that hasn't had an opportunity to have a tag team when it comes to that balancing act of doing things, how has that been something that you've been able to balance or struggle with in some way? What have you learned, and how are some ways that you go about making sure that each kid gets what they need without the jealousy and the it's not fair on conversation?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, it's very easy to look back what it for me is now 12, 14 years and say, oh, this is how I can be a great parent, because I have so many lessons that I've learned along the way, but at the time there were at least as many mistakes as there were good moments, and so it was a bumpy ride at that point. And there was, as I did change my parenting style, or I wouldn't even say my style, but just the method of how I was able to communicate with each child and connect with each child. There were at times thoughts, questions of, and in fact, there still are today. There are still comments like, well, how come you helped her with this, but you never helped me with that when I was that age? Things along those lines. And but I will say that the one thing that I incorporated at a relatively young age was I made a point to have one-on-one time with each child as often as possible. And after my older daughters had moved out, when there were the other three at home, I incorporated once a week father-daughter time, once a week, where we would have an hour and a half to 2 hours of just me and that child. And when they were younger, what that meant was maybe just me and one of the children going up to my bedroom and watching a show or playing Legos and just kind of talking as we were doing that, while the other two girls were downstairs watching a movie or playing a game or something like that. And so it wasn't leaving them alone or anything like that, but it was being creative in how to create and how to build that one-on-one connection. And that's when those conversations could come up in a more productive manner. That's when we could talk through, okay, this is what's going on here, and really kind of get to the heart of the matter. And I think that another thing that I learned over many years was to offer the children, give my kids an opportunity to create their own reward, to create what they wanted for that, what they wanted recognition to look like, what they wanted their.
At what age did you start that?
So that's relatively recent, also about 5 years ago. And so, the ages were, kind of different for each
8,
child.
9,
But
right.
Although, again, informally, at times I would ask that question. I might say, hey, these are some things I could really use some help with today. What would you like to do, after we finish this? So I wouldn't really word it as a reward, but essentially that's what I was kind of offering. Like I thought of it in terms of incentivizing the ask basically, but also it was putting them in that place of starting to think through, oh, what is important to me? What do I want? And, I will say now, by them identifying what that looks like, it really minimizes the jealousy, because they are essentially choosing kind of what that reward might look like.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think there are so many benefits for a child to have the autonomy to be for their own life and for the way things are in the family unit, because it really puts them in a place to be like, hey, I have a say here. And I think what that helps create, and something that I talk about a lot on this podcast, and obviously in my office as well, is creating an atmosphere where I can't wait to tell my parents, as opposed to, I don't want my parents to find out. And that happens when we create that. It's because of a feeling of being a part of something. And as much as it's nice to be able to sit back and say, could you do this, or can you get me this, or can you do me a favor and, do something over here, when there's a feeling of I'm a part of, because I do, and I'm doing something here. So whether it's making the consequences, or making the list of responsibilities at home, or something else, when a child feels that I'm a part of something, therefore you're going to create that atmosphere where a child will want to come back to the room and to the home as much as possible. And it sounds like by you being able to bring that in, that it has really, really allowed that. Now, I know I really want to get to, this the point specifically regarding being a single dad, but there's one more question that I have before I get to there. And I think that that's something that's really important, and I want you to talk a little bit about, is having two kids that are not biologically yours. What effect has that had on your parenting, and especially when you have three other kids that are yours, and in situations where there could be, let's call it jealousy, for lack of a better word, regarding, like, well, you treat them differently because they're yours, or something, like a comment that might be made in some way, shape, or form. How do you go about dealing with that? And what would you say to parents that are dealing with it, or a parent that's dealing with a situation where a child might not be biologically theirs, but yet it's still their child?
Yeah. Yeah, that was a challenge. And I feel that I identified that could be a challenge before we had any more kids, after my oldest two. And that is why there was such a gap. I really wanted to make sure that the adoption process had been finalized, and that we were fairly solid within our relationship. The four of us at that time, as a family unit. And I really wanted to lock that in before I had any additional kids. And so I had an awareness of that, and I think that might have helped a little bit. But here's the thing. This is the reality. There's no way to make this sound prettier than it is. It's just the truth. And that is, it felt different, when my other daughters were born. And it was just, I never had that feeling with Cheyenne and with my older two that I had with my younger three. And, my twins now are old enough where we've had these conversations and we've been able to talk about it. And it's not by choice, it's just the reality of the situation. And so I recognize that I needed to be, and even today, I need to be intentional with how I approach my relationship with my oldest two. Um, I just want to share one thing real quick, and that is that my oldest daughters did not get the best version of me. They got the impatient version, the somewhat selfish version at times, the father who worked way too much and who believed in parenting through discipline over connection. And they just did not receive the best experience when they were younger. And so part of how I have rebuilt my relationship with them, because it did suffer. When the girl's mom and I became divorced, my oldest daughters didn't want to spend time with me. And I had to work aggressively at trying to rebuild that relationship. And I know this sounds simple, but one of the most important things that I did was own my mistakes and actually apologize for them. And I think as dads, that is not something that's easy for us to do. But
As parents, it's not easy for us to do at all.
Yeah. So I had to have those conversations with them. I had to apologize specifically for the mistakes that I had made, and admit those mistakes to myself first, then have the conversation with my girls, and then to take it one step further, ask them for my forgiveness, to try to take it that one step further. And, and the response I got at times was good. And sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it was like, well, it's a little late, Dad, or whatever that might look like. And so I also had to commit to to still showing up and still trying and still doing the work regardless of the response that I got. And so that's what I did. And so unfortunately, my answer to you isn't these are all the things I did right and that's how I did that. It's more like these are all the mistakes I made and this is what I've done to rebuild that.
I'm so happy that you're saying it that way. And it's amazing how, again, I think I guess you could say, one of the constant things that we talk about here, besides for communication, is a parent being able to be fallible, and a child seeing that mom or dad have made mistakes, or we are making mistakes, and we're working on ourselves, and acknowledging that and admitting that and verbalizing that, I think, are so important in parenting. And I think that's the biggest thing that I'm taking out of everything that you've been saying so far, is that, while you may have had certain tricks up your sleeve that have made you a good dad, a lot of where you are today has a lot to do with the mistakes and the things that didn't happen. And I think it's a great lesson and very inspiring for all of us to hear how you can be in a situation where it's not the run of the mill parent. And at the same time, when we treat and we put ourselves in a position to be fallible and humble ourselves in the way and putting our egos aside, it goes such a long way regarding what the relationship is going to look like. And here they are in their late 20s, and you still have the title dad, and it's not something that I'm sure you take lightly. That being said, I'm sure there's a lot there, because between the divorce and how you got to be a single dad in the first place, do you feel comfortable talking about like what that was like, and how the story sort of got started in that area?
Yeah, I do. So, as we already kind of talked about, I became a single dad when my youngest, my 15-year-old, was a little less than a year old. And, initially that was very rough. If it was very overwhelming, even though I wasn't the perfect parent, I was a very involved parent. I tried to be very involved in my kid's life, but there was like this line in the sand when the girl's mom and I became divorced, where I went from being an involved parent to becoming a single parent. And I just felt extremely overwhelmed. I felt lonely and isolated and stressed out. And, that was the initial stages. And, there was I'm going to kind of, I hate to use this expression, but kind of jump ahead a couple of years, because basically it was a couple year period where I needed to kind of experience some personal growth. And the catalyst was the moment I pulled into the driveway to pick up my daughters for their parenting time with me, and my oldest two daughters refused to get in the car. That was what I now recognize was a catalyst for my growth. Initially, it sent me in a little bit of a spiral, but on the other side of that, it's what's led to me turning into the father that I am now, and the person that I am, which is a person who's constantly trying to improve and grow. Not perfect, a long way from perfect, but still trying to head in that direction and get a little bit better every day. And so, initially my ex-wife and I struggled in our relationship, but we settled in pretty quickly within like a year or so, which is quickly by a lot of divorce standards. And we had shared custody, and we worked together for the benefit of the kids. And for a few years, everything was fine. But then,
how many kids did you have at the point of the divorce?
We had 5.
So you guys had 5 for it. Okay.
We had 5 kids together. Yeah. My older 2 that I adopted, and then 3 between their mom and I. But then after a few years of things going well, started noticing some signs in my kids of anxiety and stress. One of my daughters, my youngest daughter, was having a lot of stomach issues, and the daughter that was just older than her, the one who was so social, all of a sudden couldn't go to friends' houses, and especially sleepovers or things like that. She really struggled to fall asleep at night. She didn't want to be the last person asleep. And then another one of my daughters was having panic attacks and was losing a small portion of her hair. And so, these signs like started happening a little bit at a time. Make a long story short, we ended up identifying that there were allegations of abuse by the girls, basically by their mom's boyfriend, and the complicity of their mom. And so um, there was police involvement and social services involvement, and it just kind of sent us down this 2-year roller coaster of chaos that kind of culminated with the girl's mom and her boyfriend's arrest, and then their release on bail, and then their mom's committing suicide. And so that's
And
how
how
I
old
moved.
was your youngest when that happened?
Yeah, my youngest was, I believe, 7 when that happened.
Okay. And you
So
guys got separated. She was how old?
1,
She was 1 when you
yeah.
guys got separated. Okay, so it was 5 years of needing to figure out and communicate with your ex, just regarding how to work and deal with custody and visitation and everything.
Yes. Yes. And that was a little bit of a roller coaster, but, we settled into a good space and supported each other. And there's a lot there. That could be an entire episode of just talking through the co-parenting relationship. But for the sake of time, I'll
Yeah.
just say that, I was at work when I received a call. I was working a night shift at a children's hospital when I received the call that by the police asking me to help give identifiers to help identify the body of the girl's mom. And it was there's a lot of things that led up to it, but it was still a horrible, horrible situation for myself, but 10 times worse for my daughters. And the following morning when I had to have that conversation with them was, the worst day of our lives. And it was extremely difficult. And, I share this story when people ask, not because I think that there are, tons of people that have a story exactly like this, but I think that we all have a story of feeling as parents, and in particular as single parents, of feeling overwhelmed and completely ill-equipped to deal with a situation that's in front of us. We all have traumatic experiences. We all have life-changing moments. And we often have this feeling of, how am I possibly going to get through this? How am I going to not screw up my kids during this process? And I think that is a story that a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah, and that could happen even in wholesome households where you have two parents that are living together under the same roof. I think that's something that can happen for us. So even when you're dealing with a situation where there's a sudden overwhelmingness, and maybe that didn't kick in right away because there's still that shock of like, oh my God, this is something that is going to it's life-changingly altering regarding how you're going to go about parenting and your life. And even though you weren't living together, but there still was a communication that had to be because of the kids and how things were, and all of a sudden you have to go about telling them the most devastating news you can ever tell a child. I'm curious, what was that like for you, and what was that experience like? Yes, I think it's fair to say it's a traumatic experience in the moment, but yet there's long-term effects to that, and how that's gonna impact both you and the relationship. So can you talk a little bit about that whole, I guess you could say, situation, or that from that morning of being able to talk to them, and where the relationships with the 5 of them went from there?
Sure. So, first of all, I will just say that it did affect me in a tremendous way, but I did not allow myself to acknowledge that or feel that. I, like so many of us, I felt like I needed to be a rock of stability for my kids during that situation. And so the way that I viewed that was put them first, 100% first. Whatever they need, make sure they have it. Meaning in terms of support, in terms of healing, in terms of, in terms of my presence and being there. And so I allowed a lot of aspects of my life to just kind of get put on hold. My physical health, my friendships, even my career, I took a step back from what I was currently doing in order to free up more time. And the truth is, I don't apologize for any of that, but I felt like that is a piece of that kind of intentional imbalance that I was referring to. But I do recognize in retrospect how it hurt me and how ultimately
The impact that
even,
it had.
yeah, even though my intentions were pure, my kids still probably weren't getting the best version of me because I wasn't taking care of myself.
Mm,
And so it was
that's a very
only
good point.
in looking back that I was able to recognize that, though.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We talk about, the example I talk about a lot over here is a car, and it's not just about putting in gasoline that's going to get the car to run long. There are so many different parts that are important to making sure that the car is going to last a long time. I think when it comes to parenting, it works the same way. And we may feel that, I could skip a meal here, or, I could go back to work for 2, 3 hours and then go to bed at 12 o'clock at night and then be up at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning taking care of stuff for the next day. And yeah, I could do that. Maybe short term, maybe once or twice. But when you get into a routine where the sense of self is not there anymore, that goes really far. And that has a really big impact and long-term effects for us and how we go about dealing with things. And I think it's really important to be able to have a healthy balance. But I think more importantly, what you're saying is even in situations where you don't have healthy balance, being able to acknowledge it, take it into consideration regarding what's happening, and saying, all right, I realize this week or the past 2 weeks have not gone well. That's okay. Let me take it. Let me start again anew here. And which I think is amazing about the fact that we have a night and a day, is that it means as continuous as the days are, they're not continuous and needing to be continued every single day. We can start anew. We can start fresh. And I think there was a certain part of you that gave yourself permission, so to speak, to be able to see things a certain way that allowed you to make certain decisions for what's going to be going forward. And I think that's really important for people to realize, is that you have to be in a position to be able to see that there are changes that need to be made. There are things that I need to be aware of, and there are things that I need to take care of for myself in order for things to go properly. Now, we're not going to say perfect, because there's no such thing when it comes to parenting, like you said. And I think it's also important to realize that there's constant adjustment that needs to be happen. But in order to make an adjustment, you have to make that the adjustee is taking care of themselves, and that's such an important part. And I'm so happy that you're bringing this up, because I think it's such an important point. Of the adjustee is just as important as the adjustments. And I think that's encapsulated a lot of what we've been talking about today. And there are so many things, Rob, that I would love to continue asking. I'll be very honest, and I don't know if I've ever said this here on the podcast, but as I prepare for every person that I have a conversation with, I have a list of things I want to get to, or certain topics and stuff. And I could say from the list that I've prepared, I've maybe done 5 or 10% of it. And there are so many things that I want to get to, but I want to be mindful of the time over here. And, before we get to rapid fire questions, I'll talk a little bit more about you. I'm curious, based on the way our conversation went today, in this awesome organic way regarding parenting 5 kids, different ages, a loss of a parent, and having to talk about that, and the fallibility and the importance of the fallibility and the adjustment that we talk about here. Are there certain things on this topic that maybe we haven't covered, or you want to talk about for a minute or two as we sort of finish up? Because I think it's such an important point. Everything we've talked about is so important. I'm curious if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to be quick with this for the sake of time, but I think that, again, looking back, I'm able to recognize that the foundation that had been set during that 5-year period prior to this major event happening in our lives allowed everybody involved to get through it more effectively and allowed all of us to handle it better. And I think the point that I want to make is that we don't always know the impact of the decisions that we make on a daily basis as we're kind of just going through life. And it's not until after situations come up that we're not expecting that we can look back and say, or over time that we can look back and say, wow, it's because of all of this that I was able to get through it. And so I just want to encourage people, regardless of whether or not they're able to see results for the actions that they are doing, to keep doing those things, to keep trusting the process, keep trying to connect with your kids, keep, trying to instill the values and establish the family culture of support, because you never know when a situation will come up that you need to lean on that foundation that you've created.
Yeah, it's so well said. And, there are so many things to sort of comment to that. And I think the one thing that I'll say to that, besides for that, that trusting the process is also trusting yourself. And I think that's really important, is that you're doing a better job than you think. Just by the fact that you might be asking the question or doubting, that shows that you're doing something right. Because if you didn't doubt yourself as a parent, you're doing something wrong. And I say that very strongly, but I mean that wholeheartedly, that we have to question ourselves, because there are so many things that come up that are we have no experience for before. And I don't think there is such a thing as experienced parenting, because we're constantly in the experience. So we want to be able to learn from it, and that's okay. We make mistakes. We're fallible. There is nothing wrong with that. I'm curious, as we sort of end up over here, maybe you could share a little bit about where people can find more of you.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking. So the best way to find out more about me, well, just to make sure that everybody is aware, I should start here. My name is Rob Rohde, and I am a single father coach. And I work with single fathers all around the world to try to help them build amazing relationships with their kids without having to sacrifice their career or their dreams during the process. I mean, that is my mission, and that is what I am all about. And I believe in linking arms with other men and standing alongside them and helping guide and be support during that process. And I do that through accountability, support, community, and coaching. And that is the process on how I work with people. And I have a new project called the Thriving Dad Project. And I chose that name with purpose because I do work mainly with single fathers. And I feel when you're a single father, you often feel like you're in this reactive state of just trying to survive and just trying to get through the day. But the dream is to move from that state to a state of being proactive and thriving in every aspect of your life. And so the Thriving Dad is the identity that we're chasing after. And I'm super excited about it. It's been a long time coming, and the best way to find out more about me and about what I am offering is on social media through LinkedIn. It's at Rob Rohde, and that's ROBROHDE. And you can also find me at my website, which is robrohde.com.
Amazing. And we're going to post links to everything in the show notes. So I appreciate for that. As we finish up over here, we're like asking some rapid fire questions. So first question for you is, quickest or go-to dinner to make at home when you're in a crunch? What would that be?
I love my crock pot meals. So it might not be super fast, but I love just throwing some chicken, some vegetables, some broth, and some seasoning in a crock pot. I can do that at the start of my day. And when work is over, dinner's done.
Amazing. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's probably the easiest thing, because you don't have to think about it the entire day. It's probably easier than picking up from the pizza store. So I think it goes really far. I'm curious, there are so many things that you've talked about regarding your growth and how you've gotten to where you are today. Is there a book, a person, or a podcast or YouTube videos that you like watching that you would recommend?
There is. I am obsessed. My new recent obsession is with a book by Dan Sullivan and Benjamin Hardy called The Gap and the Gain. And really, just to give a really quick synopsis, because I know this is rapid fire, it's really about changing your mindset to where you measure your progress backwards instead of forwards. So instead of looking at where you are versus where you want to be, instead you look at where you are to how far you have come, and it changes your mindset from one of being in the gap
Mm.
or being in more of like a negative state to being in the gain or more of a positive state. I love it.
Oh, it's awesome. That sounds amazing. So up my alley. I've never heard of it before. I've never heard of that before, but for sure something that I will look into. That is really awesome. If you could think of a babysitter from history that is not related to you, that is not alive today, that you would feel comfortable to watch your kids, who would that be?
Wow. Babysitter, anyone from history? Well, I'm going to go with an iconic figure, and I am going to say Martin Luther King Jr. And this is why. My daughters are now older. And so, first of all, even if they were younger, he is a man of integrity, an amazing leader, an amazing person. And I am sure that I would be able to trust him. But now that my kids are older, it would just be someone to hang out with them and think of all of the wisdom bombs he could drop in a couple of hours of just hanging out with them. It could change their life.
Yeah. You could stay out as long as you want with someone like him. So that's that's a really good call. My last question for you is, if you could think of an everyday mundane superpower that you would like to have as a dad that would help you as a dad, what would that be?
I'm going to say time travel. And it's not to be able to go back in time to change anything, but I am a productivity nerd. And I think about how much more productive you could be or how much time you could save if you could simply jump from one spot to the next and you could just be there. So that's what I would choose.
That's amazing. Yeah. And I guess you would love to have 27 hours in the day and not 24 the way you're talking. But yeah, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Rob. And hopefully one day we get a chance to finish my list of questions for you.
Sounds good.